understand what the dominant interpretations of today's economic situation really marks, one has to sort of reconstruct the European civilizing process, to go in mind back to a state where, well, we didn't have all this management stuff we have today. Science was really not present at all. 95% of the population were peasants or somehow working in agriculture. And a slow process with intertwined elements of integration and differentiation, we gradually had a functional and institutional, mostly represented by administration and the state, and what you could call a mental integration. So the people, for example, who mainly identified themselves before with their own village or with a family where they live, gradually began also to identify with the larger community they were living in, at least the state. While this process was anything but peaceful, was rather very violent, many wars and all that. But that process also provided the basis for having longer interdependencies, that is the precondition for a deeper and more profound division of labor. That enabled also the resources that people could, for example, delve more with science. And of course, pacification was a very important element. Pacification, that means not, well, the situation between the states was often anything but peaceful, but within the states, a slow process of inner pacification began. And that, of course, enables build-up processes, more prosperity, and you could wind it up in the formula, well, that was an increase of mankind's dominance over nature. Well, then, on a more mental level or on the level of ideas, I have here highlighted three characteristic authors, beginning with Francis Bacon, who wrote in the 17th century Novum Organon. Novum Organon was a book which tried to promote or rather emphasize the abilities of man's mental capacity to understand what is happening in nature in order to gain control over it. And another highlight I want to mention here is that, of course, Adam Smith laying the first, well, not the first, but elaborating in a remarkable way the foundations for what later became institutionalized as economic science, and of course Karl Marx, who rather tried to combine, you could say, economic science and social science and political science, and laying the foundation for what can be called political economy. So that was, you can comprise that or sum it up as the emergence of social sciences and political ideas. They were both source of an insight into the dynamics of society, which then, how to say, well, it was not, or rather the insight was that society and social developments were not steered by the will of individuals like kings or other powerful individuals, but social dynamics were dynamics of their own, and they require, in order to understand and to control them, scientific research. And the belief in science, which gradually evolved and deepened, also fostered a confidence in getting to grips with social and economic problems by scientific means. Planning is a very important aspect here. Social engineering, like crafting a whole society on the grounds of scientific insights after certain ideas, and for economics, very characteristic, Keynesianism, of course. Well, in the 20th century, aforementioned by Reinhard Loste as well, we had this bloc confrontation between the Soviet Union and the capitalist societies. And we also had a gradually improving or gradually stronger success of natural science and economics developing in that time. Came more and more to understand themselves as a sort of a natural science as well, like almost unfailable, and as well the style of economics changed very much in the 20th century. It became more and more mathematical. Then, especially the end of the bloc confrontation seemed to be something like the victory of capitalism, or the communism, seemed to be a validation of the superiority of the economic sciences of the Western world, of capitalist society, and that contributed to a hegemony, you could say, of the Homo economicus, the specific picture of man proposed by the economic sciences of the Western world, and a free market ideology, which made its way especially after 1990. And the primary political means that seemed to be advisable after that recipe were deregulation, liberalization, privatization. That was then the increasingly dominant agenda for decades. In some countries starting earlier, like in the 1970s in the United States. Here in Germany, you could say probably during the mid-80s. In other countries, maybe a bit later. And the belief behind that was, as economic science of the Western world has shown, has proved with the air of natural science, that markets were self-regulating and would always bring about the best results if they were left alone, unhindered by the state. So these were the means. And since the 1990s, you could say, there was a special brand of capitalism evolving, which can be truly be characterized as financial market capitalism, where a core element was that the financial institutions, like hedge funds or big insurances, they created a new product, more profit, more yield, and then a competition around more yield, more profit evolved. So whereas before it was normal for a corporation to have a profit rate of about 7 or 8%, now it had to perform at about 20 or 25% profits. Well, as we all know, we had several severe crises, the last one starting in 2008 with the fall of Lehman Brothers. And one could ask if that is now the end of financial market capitalism, if there is now really a reverse trend, and if we now maybe come to a position from where we can tackle the crisis. And as I said in the beginning, we have we have multiple crises, and we do not only have multiple crises, but they also mutually exacerbate each other. Especially with the last mentioned, which probably came to the scientific debate with the aforementioned report by the Club of Rome. We have reached certain planetary boundaries, ecological limits, climate change, etc. I will briefly sketch those crises that are intertwined somehow. The first of all, of course, here you can see how the financial markets got out of control. In the darker line indicates the profit rates of financial institutions, and the lighter line indicates the profit rates of non-financial institutions. And you can see how the profit rates in financial institutions somehow emancipated themselves from the real world at the beginning of the 1980s, crashed down with the Lehman Brothers crisis in 2008, and well, here we are again. The old course seems to be set again. And it's absolutely clear that this is in no way sustainable. We have another crisis incomes generated via market activities. The total net income is the income or the income equality that you have after redistribution, after paying taxes, after receiving social benefits. And you can see both of them were rapidly rising since the 1980s. Then we have an unemployment crisis, or exclusion crisis you could say, with especially in some European countries, spectacularly rising rates of unemployment. In Spain, I've heard they have now about 50% unemployment among young people under the age of 25. And of course, that's a recipe for social disaster. That's also, of course, in no way sustainable. And the last, and maybe in the future most challenging, biggest crisis is that we have already transgressed certain planetary boundaries. What you see here are certain spheres where a team of international researchers has tried to find sort of the safe operating spaces for humanity. Because there are certain natural processes, biochemical processes, which well, can only reproduce or can only be sustained within certain limits. And you see here that in regards to climate change and in regards to the nitrogen cycle, especially caused by agriculture, and in the sphere of biodiversity loss, we have since a long time already transgressed those boundaries. So it's not possible to sustain our level of consumption or level of economic activity at this level. We also must go certain levels back in order to really have what you can somehow reasonably call sustainability. Now, these were, or these crises sort of built a larger framework within the project Social Growth, or the project before that, Future 2020, of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation started. But the project itself, they had a very specific starting point, or very specific cause, and that was the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung conducted a study in 2007 analyzing the political milieus in Germany. The underlying motive was to find, okay, which groups do we have in Germany that are, well, for which certain income levels and also certain orientations are characteristic, and how can they be addressed in order to gain votes from them, in order to win parliamentary elections. But the study turned out quite a different result, and that was quite startling, because here, in these 9 menus, I won't translate all the titles because there are just a few of particular interest. There were 3 groups that somehow seemed to be no more interested in political processes whatsoever, so no chances for them of a bettering of the situation, and that's almost a third of the population. And when you look closer at these milieus, you see that most of them are unemployed, have low income, are out of jobs, don't see any perspectives for them. So the idea of the project then was to find some ways how to get them back into society again. The results of this study, they also fit to results of other studies, which show that we have an increasing inequality, especially in Germany. And here you can see the rates of the increase in income in different countries. Top Germany, then the United States, then the average of 15 OECD countries, Great Britain and France. And what you can see is that at around the year 2000, the inequality in Germany increases faster than in any other country. So that was the basis. And when you try to interpret this, or what we did was to look at other interpretations, like what does it mean, or first, what we had to deal with was the popular interpretations. Funny enough, what is dominant in today's debate is rather that we have to abandon growth because, well, we have this thing with climate change and all that. But back in the 80s, mainstream was rather saying, well, it's not in our will. Well, we can't decide if we want to abandon growth or not, because the end is reached. Definitely. Sooner or later, the end of prosperity will come, and this has been dubbed by one author as well, what we have been experiencing from the 1940s to the 1970s. That was just the short dream of prosperity. Well, other interpretations are we cannot pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Background of that is the only possibility for Germany to survive in a global economy is to expand its export sector, and we can only expand our export sector by lowering wages, basically by lowering our standards of living. So that as well would mean farewell to prosperity. Then popular vision also is that always costs are too high, the wages are too high, already mentioned that, but also health costs are too high, public administration costs are too high, everything just costs, and well, we have to lower these costs. But what is overseen by these positions is that those costs also represent income to those people that bring these services. Well, then the puzzle is how do we start this process? Like, well, when you start with more expenditures, that is something that has often been tried to do, and that often meant rising state or rising public debt. Well, of course, this would create more income would create more demand, and maybe that would bring about a self-sustainable, self-carrying growth process. But the question remains where it starts, yeah?
I was just wondering, the third point, which, about whose income are you talking about?
The income of those who, well, deliver those services.
Those healthcare services?
Yeah, for example, exactly. And it has been the official policy of our government here in Germany to explicitly lower the costs, for example, in the health sector. But as we know, for nurses or for many people being employed in hospitals, that hasn't been a very pleasant situation there. And to come to today's discussion with the post-growth society or degrowth discussion, one can also pose the question, well, is abandoning growth altogether, is that a good idea? I mean, would that be a good way to not only challenge the climate change and ecological catastrophe, but also to sustain prosperity and to sustain or to improve inclusion and to improve social cohesion? Well, one could say a bit cynical, the role models for degrowth society or societies which we can observe today would be, for example, Greece, Spain. Well, they have a degrowth process, and it's uncontrolled, and we see very, well, disturbing results. Now, the question remains, where is the starting point to get such a growth process running? And maybe I should also mention another aspect that is important here to keep in mind. The degrowth debate and also the proponents of growth, they often neglect that it is very important to see what kind of growth do you have. Because GDP measures a lot. It measures positive economic activity, what we would, for example, associate with maybe education or healthcare. And it can also comprise negative elements, like, well, for example, when tanks are produced or we have those SUVs, of course, they represent GDP and in some cases rising GDP, but those are very, well, they ecological impact and in regards to sustainability. So it is one important thing to care about growth in some way, but it's even more important than to ask what kind of growth you really have. But the starting point here now was, well, the popular measures that were taken to reach growth. Were they in any way successful? Well, the process we had here in Germany, or rather the popular position was, well, you just have to make it for corporations easier to make profit, because then they will reinvest more and that will create jobs, and jobs mean prosperity, and that will benefit all. Now what you see here is the development of corporate profits, the red bars, which, well, I think they're quite impressively rising, and the investments the corporations made then. And you can see that there wasn't really any correlation between those. The corporations did not invest, but rather they used those profits to place them on financial markets and make ever more profits. Other thing is also popular position here in Germany until at least a few years is that inequality and freedom, that will lead to growth and prosperity. Why? Because inequality is an incentive for individuals involved to improve their situation, to do something. And the freedom is that, well, that they can do so. They're allowed to do so, and they're not hindered by the state or so. What we have in reality is the cycle you see here. You rather have high rates of inequality, which result in lesser demand. Lesser demand results in less investment and growth. That normally would mean decreasing returns, decreasing corporate profits, and that would lead to a decreasing value of assets, and then to crisis and inequality again. Well, the detour that has been tried for a few years, several times, was to place it on financial markets again and to go into speculation and risk. That well, facilitates the emergence of bubbles, and when those bubbles crash, then you have again crisis and rising inequality. Now, from these analyses, we try to take a closer look what really happened in Germany with GDP development, how it was composed, how it developed over time, and compared it to that of the United States. The result is that you can see here. Underlying that, still another remark. In mainstream economics, or rather the common knowledge in economics is that GDP always consists of two variables. The one is the GDP produced per hour, and the other is GDP per capita. Oh, wait a second, no. Forget about that. I had something else in mind. No. What we tried here to compare is the famous assumption that it is especially the GDP per hour that brings about more growth and contributes more to prosperity. And we try to compare that to the development in the United States. And what you can see here is that the GDP per hour work in Germany was, in comparison to the United States, steadily rising, or rather it was coming near to the United States productivity level, but the GDP per capita somewhat stagnated in comparison to the United States. And yeah, the question was then, okay, how can that be? Is it just that people really work that less, or do we have this famous demographic problem that has been, or is still propagated here? The assumption that we have more and more old people to care for, and less and less workforce. To analyze that, we undertook something that you can call a GDP decomposition. that is decomposing the GDP in its elements, how it comes about. And we made this from the years from 1970 to 2007. Here it is given in absolute numbers, in I think US dollar at value of the year 2000, I think it was. And you can see, okay, a moderate rise in the GDP per capita. And indeed, a decreasing or a decrease in the work hours worked per capita per member of the population. And looking behind that, that combined with the GDP worked per hour, of course, that results in the growth rates of the GDP per capita. And what you see here then in those yellow blocks is the part of those people who are really employed as part of the workforce. That means people in active age and really being able to work. And here we can see the part of the workforce on the active population, a remarkable rise in the years between 2000 and 2007. That means people who were formerly defined as not being able to work, they were put into the active population, and well, with certain official regulations are also more or less, let's say, forced to work. And qualities, in this case, from the supply side, really are disguised into that what we call GDP and GDP growth. You could also do this for example, the resources consumed in different areas. You can always decompose that into smaller and smaller parts to see where the real reasons are for certain developments, and then where to take measures to, when you try to, for example, to correct developments you don't want to have. Now, on the basis of these analyses, the German growth dilemma can be summed up in two main points, you could say. Well, if you go back to this one, you can see that the main reason why the German GDP growth remains behind that of the United States is obviously the less hours worked per capita, and that well, consists then in two problems maybe. The one is unemployment, the other is involuntary part-time work, and in order to come to more employment or to more hours worked, it would be possible to fight unemployment and less part-time jobs. Yeah.
Is that what you saw in the red boxes? That through part-time jobs, through jobs subsidized by the state and so on, the rates of the working force go up?
Mm-hmm. That is or to some extent, that's what the government back then tried to do, is to heighten the part of the population that can be counted to the workforce and to exert pressure on people to go into jobs. But the thing is, what we experienced here in Germany was, well, there are more people now in jobs, and there are moderately more hours worked, because many part-time jobs then started to exist. But if you just try to build up employment in so-called low productivity sector, and this was the service sector to a large extent here, then in the end you might win nothing, because you have more employment but less productivity. And people personally might experience that as lost prosperity, because now they have to work and have less spare time. And then on a macroeconomic level, well, we have a famous discourse here also fostered by the parties in the German Bundestag, is to make industrial policy, because that is what would bring about really prosperity and all that. But the thing is, employment in industry will be in the long run decreasing because it has a high potential for rationalization, becoming more and more productive, whereas employment in services, sure enough, it was increasing and it will still, also in the future it will increase. Just think of healthcare and care for elderly people in an aging society. But the question there is, what about the productivity? It seems to be only possible with low productivity. So on that analysis, we made a comparison with other countries which are more or less comparable to Germany, which are of a comparable size, which have more or less comparable population. And here we saw something interesting. What you have here is the development of productivity per hour worked in different countries. Here Germany, France, Sweden, UK, the United States, and the average of 15 core countries of the European Union. And you can see for the left table that the productivity increase in industry is of course quite high, has been quite high over the time here observed. And in market services it's been not that high, but most countries also have quite remarkable productivity increases, except for the last time one country, that was Germany. Germany was the only country in this time here that has a had a decrease in productivity in the service sector. Now that is quite remarkable. And we try to assess that deeper. So we had two studies convened. The one was a large international comparison undertaken by the Conference Board. They are specialized in measuring productivity. Then we had also a scenario analysis. I don't know if that's familiar to you. Scenario analysis is, you could say, a simulation of the economic development modeled in a rather complex formula, you could say. The formula that this guy, Klaus Bartsch, used consists of 900 specific formulas, and this sort of a model of Germany. And what you do with that is you, for example, change taxation, you, for example, change labor costs in certain areas, and then you can see what happens. Of course, always ceteris paribus, that means if everything else remains stable. But for illustrative purposes, it's still quite useful. And also, we were looking for an alternative prosperity indicator. I guess Hans Diefenbacher, he will surely say something about that too, because prosperity still until now, it is just measured by GDP. And what we were interested in it still is, now what results do you get when you also include distribution, when you include external effects, when you include the use of fossil resources? That's what we try to develop. And on that we had the follow-up project, which is social growth. And the social growth project itself, it had two main projects, you could say. One was a careful analysis of the care sector, and other analysis of the health economy. And both studies tried to follow the goal, what happened, or what would happen if you would significantly increase employment and wages in those sectors. What effect does that have for the rest of society and for the rest of the economy? That we were concentrating on those sectors has, of course, the reason that within the framework of social growth that tries to be also ecologically sustainable, it would be a good idea to have more employment and more economic activity in those sectors where there are really unsatisfied needs. And that is definitely the case in the care sector. We have a situation here in Germany where people, when they care for the elderly people privately, really have a very difficult situation. They don't have enough time to do that, they don't have enough money to do that. Then the overall health economy is also a sector where there are still unsatisfied needs. It's named as third one, very important, that is education on all levels. And the ecological impact of more employment and economic activities in those areas certainly has very little impact on ecology and environment. Certainly less impact than in automobile industry or something like that. And
how do you measure social inequality? Is it only per capita income, or is it also other aspects like access to health insurance or access to education?
Well, the point from where we started was the classical inequality, that is just in income. But it was very difficult for us to include that systematically, the question of access to services, for example. That was not systematically included, but it was always like a hint at the side or something that we tried to include when developing the model that would lead really to a more unjust prosperity for all men. So it wasn't systematically included in the analysis because it proved to be very difficult to do that. To sum the results up, growth of productivity and of employment are compatible when there are, what's the word for that? Well, when the state really takes the right measures. But the thing is to transform it into an economically sustainable process, then it is important to have stable demand, because only stable demand would foster more investment and could create more additional jobs. The recipe that other countries tried to achieve that was, in the United States, bad loans to poor households. We saw where that led to in 2008. In Sweden, a more attractive model. They tried to provide those services and create more employment and therefore satisfy the demand, especially via public services. For that, of course, they need significantly higher taxes, something unfortunately a bit unpopular over here. And what Germany tried to do in order to achieve growth process was that we were and still are very much relying on exports. Also the way that our government now tries to work through the crisis heavily relies on exports. And if you always run an export surplus, like Germany did throughout the last year and still is doing, you run up, let's say, huge surpluses that can only be transformed in huge loans to foreign countries, a very unstable model. And what you still don't get to grips with is the weak expansion of domestic demand, especially for services. So you need to provide alternative access to that. To illustrate how a circulation of income that could be self-carrying can be achieved, we try to model different ways those income streams can take in productive cycles. Sorry, forgot to mention that. As a starting point, you have the household income from wages and other earnings, as well as social transfers. Those again, they transform a very large part, of course, into consumer spending, to another large part in taxes and contributions, and for most people, a smaller part savings. And well, the consumer spending, of course, goes directly into production for the market because it's being spent on food, transport, tourism, whatsoever. And the savings ideally should go into lending by the financial sector, which then can also support the production for the market, as well as the production of public goods and services, which ideally should mostly be financed over taxes and contributions, which also provide the means for transfers. And ideally then you can resume the cycle again with the household income from wages and other earnings, as well as social transfers plus new net debt. But in order to keep this cycle going, there are two very important preconditions. The first one is distribution, because when you have very unequal distribution, then many demands cannot be articulated in the market. If you have a weak state that does not provide necessary goods and services, then those demands cannot be met for poor people. And if you have part of the population who save very, very much, then you might have large saving, or maybe saving, no, that is not the right word. Well, the problem is then that excessive saving might lead to those speculation tendencies, which I have illustrated before. So, two very necessary preconditions, that is more equal distribution, which is very important, and regulation of the financial market. And the other one I wanted to mention was a strong role of the state, maybe an important point for the discussion of the conference here. To start with the first thing, better distribution. How do you get there?
Quick question.
Yeah.
What is this net debt? What is net debt?
German word is Neuverschuldung.
Ah, okay.
I don't know if that is more familiar in English. It's the new debt the states take then. Okay. So, the concrete policy options that we developed here. First is professionalization of ambulant care with a plus of 300,000 professional caregivers. Then that has to be financed, of course. Therefore, we need tax justice. The German trade union Verdi, they developed a concept which primarily envisioned continuous instead of graduated progression in income tax, and as well significantly higher maximum tax rates. Then the unemployment compensation would have to be improved significantly as well in order to improve distribution. And then large issue throughout the last days here, because of our negotiations with Switzerland, is the redoubling of the effective tax load on private capital gains. Because normally, if you compare the situation in Germany with with other countries here in Germany or in the world, we have a quite a high nominal tax rate on private capital gains. But the real effective tax load that we get from private capital gains is much, much lower than that. And that also has to do with, what's the English word for Steueroase, tax havens. And those, of course, would have to be tackled in some way. Then, of course, what we would need here in Germany would be a general and gradually increasing minimum wages. Apart from Germany, there are only 2 other countries within the European Union that don't have a general minimum wage. And therefore, in some areas here in Germany, especially in agriculture sector and in food industry, we sometimes have hourly wages of about 2.50, €3, and of course nobody can live on that. Yeah.
Do you redouble the effective tax load on private capital gains? Does that mean increase taxes or reduce taxes?
The point is the effective tax load. We have a nominal tax, that is private capital gains 25%, but what we really get from that is just a little fraction of that, because there are so many possibilities to get around the tax, and you have to close those possibilities in the long run, or in the medium run. Of course, apart from that, a little bit higher tax on private capital gains, as well as on big wealth and Erbschaften and heritage. I mean, higher taxes on those capital gains would be advisable, but our main problem now is the effective tax load, what we really get from that, from the nominal tax. Yeah, and as the last point, what we would need for a sustainable and environmentally friendly growth process would be a rule-based wage policy, and the rule of thumb would be macroeconomic productivity role. Reinhard Loske mentioned, for example, the 2% you usually have in more developed countries as the progress of hourly productivity, and you would have to add for that the compensation for the target inflation rate. I have to mention that the European Central Bank, they always set out for an inflation rate of near but a little bit under 2%, and that would be the admirable outcome in their view. And therefore, as a rule of thumb for rule-based wage policy, you would always have roughly about 4.5%. For those of you more familiar with the situation in Germany, you probably know that the average wages in the private sector have been for years on end in real terms stagnant, and nominally we sometimes only had an increase of about 1.5 or 2%, and that remains well below that what would be needed for a self-sustaining growth process.
I've got a question concerning that. So with this macroeconomic productivity, you mean that everyone should get that much more, which the whole economy gets more in productivity, and not only those sectors which actually have an increase in productivity?
That's a very important point. You have certain areas of the economy where you naturally have a higher increase in productivity. That's, for example, as mentioned in industry, and you have areas in the economy where naturally you don't have that large productivity growth rates, which usually is in the service sector. As shown, it must not be, or it doesn't need to be as severe, the difference in Germany, because in other countries it had not been that severe. But in order to reach a more just distribution, it would really be, would be a good idea to have a macroeconomic rule of thumb. That is, only because the productivity in industry might have been risen by 6.5%, so they are the only ones who can claim to get 6.5 higher wages. And those in the service sector whose productivity has maybe only risen by 2%. And if you extrapolate that into the future, you can probably imagine that the gap gets bigger and bigger. So it's better to have an average measure. But in reality, and for the social partners, the trade unions on the one hand and the employers on the other hand, it's of course always a political process how to get there. But it's would also be a good idea for them to keep that in mind, because in the long run everybody profits from a self-sustaining growth process. Yeah.
I still didn't really understand what you mean with macroeconomic productivity, because how do you justice an increase in wages in the service sector if there is no increase in productivity. I mean, if the employer doesn't have more
Yeah.
more to offer.
What simply happens then is the employer maybe could offer more if he takes higher prices for the services he offers. And that is what happens. Because the productivity of, say, a barber, for example, I don't think that his or her productivity today is significantly higher than maybe 40 or 50 years ago. But, well, so now you have to pay a bit more for a haircut. So in order that the barber can also exist in the society. So the
Yeah, but then how are you to achieve the target inflation rate of only 2%?
Again,
If you say that, okay, now we raise the wages for people in the service industry and service sector, so that then the employers will have to raise the prices for their services, for haircuts and all this, so then you will have a higher inflation rate, and then you probably won't be able to achieve this 2 percentage point goal.
that is why it's so important to also sustain a growth process on this macroeconomic level. And this can be facilitated on the one hand through the productivity increases you have in other sectors, and on the other hand in more demand that is facilitated by those higher wages. If you simply, or if everything else stays the same in society and you just increase wages, of course, then you have nothing more but inflation. So it's always a very how to say, a very sensitive process. You also had a question?
I'm already finished.
Okay. Good. Yeah, that are those measures we would advise for a better distribution as part of this social growth process. Emphasize social. And well, it could be summed up maybe as the Fordist model of peace and capitalism as a role model. Of course not the Fordist model that we in reality have, with a strong emphasis on the automobile sector, but rather with a strong emphasis on social services. Then also emphasizing mass purchasing power and demand for services. Mass purchasing power instead of ever higher savings and export surpluses. Then the additional employment would mostly be created in the service sector, care, education, health, and a word to productivity development in parts of that service sector where they're still possible, of course, is, for example, in the health sector, there's still much leeway for productivity increases by if you use information and communication technologies for tasks which can be easily standardized, routinized, all those complex reporting that has to be done today and which is mostly still done by paper formulas, you could easily rationalize that with information and communication technology. And what is also important for that is that when you try to raise productivity in those areas, what you need is a systemic approach instead of isolated view. Because if you look at the health systems as a whole system, and not only at the whole workplace, at a single workplace, then you can see, of course, very different opportunities for improving productivity, for improving also the quality of work there. Yeah, just to end, short mentioning of the 10-point program that the social growth program comprises. The first one, and what I've started with, is of course effective financial market regulation. On the one hand, you need stable supply of credit for the real economy. On the other hand, you need somewhat a disarmament of the financial sector. And with that, aimed on the one hand at many of the products and instruments which are being dealt with at financial markets, and of course those ridiculously high profit rates they seem to generate, one has to say, because one has to ask, well, where in reality are these profit rates based? And of course they have the flip side in the internal structures of financial institutions. For example, the ridiculously high wages of managers, for example, that's absolutely not sustainable in the long run and socially sustainable. Then education policy, of course, not only the investments in bricks and mortar, so to say, so in technical infrastructure is an investment, but also education is one of the best investments one can undertake. And as well, education policy, if not only aimed at qualification, but also political education and cultural education, you could say that is an element of prosperity itself. Not only education as a means for something else, but also education as a means in itself. And industrial policy, there we probably come closest to the debate that was also the issue this morning, with an industrial policy that tries to facilitate the conversion of fossilistic industry. For example, coal, automobile, I mentioned that, and maybe also in the arms sector, to renewable energy, to energy efficiency. There you can, or there you have probably the best vantage point from where to also make the economy more sustainable in an ecological sense. And another contribution to the lessening of inequalities, of course, to strengthen the position of employees. That is through the promotion of minimum wages, as already mentioned, and also the strengthening of co-determination. There have been many positive experiences here in Germany in the long run, but funny enough, each time when in a corporation or a company co-determination is to be introduced, when it hasn't been there before, somehow the employers are very unwilling to do so. Well, of course, because at first glance their range of freedom is limited by that, but for the companies and corporations in the long run it's usually the better option. Then, of course, the reform of tax policy. The task is then to fund public tasks properly and fairly. I have sketched those elements of higher income tax and the continuous increase instead of gradual increase. Point 6 is anti-cyclical fiscal policy to stabilize the economy and the debt situation. Reinhard Loske mentioned the particular instrument of the debt brake that the German government will be introducing in 2016, I think, and which will probably also be implemented on the area of the economic union. But I don't know if a debt brake in that form is a good idea, because in times of a recession, some sector of the economy has to have the opportunity to put up more debt, and that is usually in a recession only the state. But what also should be done in good times then is, of course, to lower the debt, and that is rather the error that has been made in the future, and not the taking up of new debt in times of crisis, which was quite visible in the last time we were facing the crisis, even though you might doubt if the measures taken then were always the right, or if they were always green enough. But in the end, it's very important that the state remains or keeps the possibility for action. Then, of course, this has a European level and you also need to have a robust public financial architecture. So this anti-cyclical fiscal policy is not something only to be applied to Germany, but in an economic area such densely integrated as the European Union, you also need public financial architecture that is somewhat coordinated on a European level. Then it's not only the fiscal politics that must be better attuned to each other, but it's also the economic policy in the narrower sense. That is also a very important point to provide for more stability in the Eurozone. What is meant by that? You probably have noticed that in the Fiscal Stability Pact of the European Union, countries which run high export deficits, in future they will have to pay a fine when they run up those deficits, whereas countries that run high export surpluses, they don't have to pay such a fine. And that, of course, makes no sense, because the surplus of the one is the deficit of the other. And if you really want to have a mechanism here that works out, then you have to do it for both sides. And that is, for example, something that is hidden behind the economic policy coordination. Then, very important is European and global standards to ensure decent work for all. What we had throughout the last years was often a competition for lower wages, for lower work standards, you could say, and that might raise the competitiveness of one company for a certain time. But if all companies do that for a longer time, then of course you have in the long run a race to the bottom. And if you want to prevent that, then you have to ensure those European and in the long run also global standards. Yeah, and the last one, biggest task, that would be a new economic and monetary order in order to manage globalization. Of course, far beyond Germany's scope as a single actor. But if you, for example, want to effectively abolish tax havens, then you can do this only on a global level. If you really want to have effective financial transaction tax, then it would be most effective on a global level. And that money, of course, then could also be used to reduce global imbalances or help countries that came into a crisis or which just experienced a crisis. And yeah, that would be, in the long run, the goal. Yeah, one can only hope that it would be can be realized. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm at the end of my presentation. I hope it was a bit understandable. I really have to be sorry because I have to apologize because that's the first time I present this in English. I only 2 times before presented this in German, and to me it seemed to me a bit more coherent, and I hope I could transport a bit. Thank you.
Definitely not only an issue in Europe or Germany, but even more so maybe if we look at the development worldwide, keeping developing countries in mind. How do you see it if we look at any developing country? How do you provide social or foster social growth for countries that are not as economically developed as Germany, for instance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because in the long run, the goal of this project would be that the social growth model is applicable as well to development countries. But I have tried to sketch the development of this project specific starting point was here in Germany. Of course, the framework was from the beginning with sensitiveness for global problems, but its primary aim was to solve the problems here. And it's just been gradually evolving that the situation beyond Germany, and there in the first place would also be Europe, they stand more in the front. And to make this model applicable in development countries, you probably would have to make more, or we would have to make more of a translation and more, or undertake more studies how the situation there specifically is. But what can be definitely said is this whole social growth model, it takes a very, or puts a very strong emphasis on the role of the state. And that would also be the case for development countries. And there you always probably have the problem that, or to ensure that the state's action are really in favor of the people.
Yeah, thank you for that. And another more precise question from my side would be, in order to have social growth, like before that, is that only the second step, social growth, and as the first step, economic growth? How can we go to social growth right away? To make economic growth social right away, and not,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Ideally, that would be the case from the start,
Yeah.
to have social growth from the beginning. But because social growth tries to combine several elements of traditional growth, prosperity, more income, and on the average more income is a desirable objective here. But the emphasis is on better distribution in every case, and so or to put more elements of social growth in economic development from the beginning on, that would be definitely invest as much as you can in education.
I have a question about whether the Russian actually has measures in mind to implement this 10-point program, because to me several of the 10 points actually sound really difficult, if not at this point rather not possible things to do. Like, for example, to ensure decent work for all, how is it possible to keep any business from moving to, for example, here it's often Eastern Europe because wages are lower and costs for producing goods are lower, and are there any, or the example of education, which is also in Germany a great problem, are there any exact measures that should be taken?
Yeah, of course. The border problem, or the threat that the company would then just simply go somewhere else where the standards are lower, that is something you always have, and that fair enough points to the problem that it's usually more easy to implement those standards on a national level. But as well, I mean, we have a European integration process, especially with the Eurozone, where there are many standards for the different countries. But what has been particularly spared until now is the social dimension. Like, we have many standards in terms of trade, and
I just want to say to the subject, I think what this program tries to show, it's not about if it's going to be possible, to do that, but I think it shows that it is necessary while we are talking about economic crisis, and while we're talking about giving up sovereignty towards a combined financial policy in Europe, I think this program and also the speaker before, they both show that it's necessary to talk about the social aspects in a European sense. And that even though it might be very hard to ensure decent work for all, there are standards globally already through the global union, work union, which can be looked at all over the world at. And of course, probably somebody in Romania is going to earn less wage than in Germany and France and other countries. But still, it's not about the same, being it like making it equal all over Europe, but making it equal towards the living standards in each of the countries. And I think this program just shows that because you say it's impossible to do that, that it is necessary to get up there in a huge debate all over Europe and not only in this tiny room.
Before I answer your question, maybe just to illustrate one point of what it means, those standards for decent work. For example, when you emphasize a minimum wage, then if that is implemented in the part of this program, then we do not talk about, say, €8.50 in every country of the European Union, but there the measure would be, well, minimum wage is probably the 40% of the average wage at the national level. That would be such a coordination, for example. It's still specific for the country and still is part of a shared standard.
It's not that I doubt the necessity of discussing measures to actually tackle the problems that arise within this context, but it's the fact that, as you just said, there are organizations that do try to implement some of these things globally, and as I don't know, example, the ILO, they have loads of they've taken loads of measures, but even if that's the problem with states in general, even if they say, well, we'll do it, even if they sign it, they don't necessarily implement it in their own country, which is basically, and that's kind of the thing, if it doesn't really work here, even if we talk about it, then it's, in a globalized world, it's even more difficult to actually catch something that will work on a level that makes it.
But of course, I see what you mean, and I was talking about the ILO as well. But I think the thing is that, you know, starting this maybe in Europe with the European Union, you could create a force to ensure that those standards are going to be enforced and that they are going to hold up to its means. Of course, globally, an organization like the ILO is not able to do that, but I think in Europe, with a load of institutions who could be responsible for something like this, I think this would be a good starting point, and I think it would be possible as well.
Yeah, and you also have to see that some of the elements that are really strong focused here on a national level, and our idea as Friedrich Ebert Foundation, close to the Social Democratic Party, is ideally the party close to us would pick this up for the next time they're in government. Okay, you also had a question.
Yeah. How do you think about the microeconomic sectors, such as small medium enterprises, as effective for the socio-economic growth in Europe?
Could you please repeat? I didn't get the beginning.
How do you think about the small medium enterprises sector from the microeconomic, as it's effective for the socio-economic growth in Europe?
Yeah, but well, of course, small and medium enterprises would benefit from such a program as well. I don't know if I got your question right, but when we are talking here of a macroeconomic level, it's well, ideally when there are policies implemented which are beneficial, that well, also small enterprises can benefit from them. It's no mutual exclusion. I don't know if that got your question. Yeah?
Another one concerning another aspect, whether like this social growth is kind of I like the Green New Deal, for example, kind of a vision of different growth rather than the growth idea or the growth concept that is like generally grasped at the moment. And what I would be interested in, whether you just said, I think you heard Loska's speech, what you personally think about the post-growth or degrowth idea instead of growth.
Yeah, I tried to illustrate that at the beginning with the question GDP growth or qualitative growth. If the post-growth discourse mainly focuses just on GDP growth, then I would say that doesn't make very much sense. I mean, we used that as a starting point too, to somehow foster GDP growth whatsoever, and then look closer. But the second step is very important. For me, as well from the perspective of this project, a degrowth policy would not make sense. You would have to ask, what should degrow? What should shrink? And in our opinion, it's of course those sectors that are based on fossil fuel. They can and should shrink. But in order for society's well-being and in order to ensure social cohesion, of course we need still job opportunities for people. A feasible means would perhaps also be lowering of working time, but still, at least our society as it is constituted until today is based upon a situation where most people have at least the opportunity to have a job, and then we have to ask if there are some sectors that should shrink, what should grow instead? And our answer would be health, education, care, social services, culture.
But isn't the very idea of degrowth is not only, or post-growth is not only concerning economy, and that's kind of one of the things that are, in my opinion at least, that are not talked about enough, because, well, if you try to figure out a concept of social growth, then if you think about post-growth, you have also to consider not only, I mean, social is kind of depending on culture, on lifestyle too, and it's not all about job opportunities, which are also, I mean, of course, also great aspect of the whole thing, but in general, like the consumption criticism and things like that, that actually are part of the whole post-growth idea, that are usually not even mentioned in those discussions, but it's always everything focused on the economy point, and that's what I don't really understand, because it's, for me at least, it's part of the whole thing, because if we don't change the way we think about using things, it doesn't really help to change the way we think, or to change the concept of growth that we actually have.
Yeah, that's fair criticism, and it's true enough that has not been part of this project. We were really focused on the economic dimension, partly due to capacity restrictions, but also partly due to being able to address our institutional partners. We not only have much to do with the Social Democratic Party, but also with trade unions, and it's easier to communicate that when you focus more on that. When was well, still dealing with consumer policy until half a year. There, of course, it struck me that the consumerism, as you could say, a certain civilization pattern runs in some way really counter to any strategy in regards to sustainability, because the function that consuming products has for, you could say, the reproduction and stabilization of self-esteem is one that is not really compatible with sufficiency or with lowering material consumption. But that's, to be honest, that was not part of this project.
Other projects who think about social economy, like a theory or model for social economy. Because to me, if we want to have social growth, it's not about having an economic model and then wanting like you start with an economic model, but you want social improvement. And to me, somehow, if you only single out this economic model and work on it, I don't see how it will lead to overall social behaviorism, change in social behavior, maybe. Yeah. And if what we address, what the speaker addressed before, that we need to change our attitude towards things in order to make a difference and to change the way we live in order to be sustainable, then I think we need to find a way to combine disciplines, yeah? Not to work in our own disciplines by ourselves, but have an overarching project. Because I think this economic problem also has to go to the basics. And of course you are modeling for your customers, for your clients, I don't know how to call it, yeah? But maybe also you want to show them, give them an option and show them that there is a social way of doing economics. Now you just give them an economic model that touches upon these topics. It would maybe for a future project, or I just don't know, maybe there is something out there, I have no idea.
To my knowledge, not yet planned. I mean, it's not mutually exclusive in a way. I think it's still useful to have a model, or at least to have, I mean, one should rather say, have a discussion on a model of a social economy or social growth, because this is always work in progress. It gets enhanced, must be actualized from time to time, and all that. It's all part of the discourse. And I guess, or I think, there are other aspects or other activities where those problems that you mentioned are addressed. Just for example, to mention one, we were participating with ATTAC, you probably know that organization, and a large congress which took place last year in Berlin, which was called Beyond Growth, where we also addressed those questions, like not only if we needed a certain alternative economic model, but also maybe a different way of organizing economy, with strengthening of cooperations, for example, with solidaric economy and all that. And it's part of the discourse, I'd say, where this project that I presented here today is situated. But of course, this project does not comprise all elements of the discourse.
What I found interesting in what both of you said, it struck me during the presentation beforehand as well, that everybody always talks about we have to create the right circumstances in order to change our way of living, instead of doing it together right away. That's kind of, I think, what you were saying. And especially in the presentation before, but also here, it's always only about policy, but there's like no space, neither in that model nor what Mr. Luske was talking about, for room to create new ways of living. For example, I mean, how can it be that all over Europe we are trying to deal with this financial crisis and spending money on that and going farther and further into debt while we cut education, while we cut any kind of cultural support, where those are the spaces you are talking about too in the second point. Those are the spaces where I think no new ideas of living and new ideas of consumerism and so on could be created. But I think right now there's not really lots of room for that at all.
Yeah.
And I think this is especially for you close to the Social Democratic Party as well as Mr. Lesky close to the Green Party. Those should be aspects of policy as well in all those social growth models and all growth models.
Yeah, my personal opinion, sure enough, there should be room for that in the models, but in regards to policy, I'm a bit more reluctant, because I think those areas of value, or those value discourses, I don't know if the established politics of today, the established parties of today, if those are the right institutions to address those questions. There I would rather say, that's part of civil society, of movements, of well, civil society where politics and political parties are somewhat also part of, but that's really a discourse that should comprise the whole society, and there I would not see that especially political parties would be well, the best senders of, or best communicators in that discourse.
Maybe they should start to integrate themselves back into society and not be separated from society. I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I think it's the original job of parties to be a forum for exactly the discussion in society. The parties who shall help to articulate it within government. And I think if we say this shall be apart from government in a special civic sphere, we have a severe distinction between government and society. I think this is really dangerous.
Okay, no, then that probably was a complete misunderstanding. What I was a bit, or what I would find problematic is, if we, for example, would develop such a project and then say, wow, this results, these values would be good if the Social Democratic Party would advise to the people. And that's, of course, not the way it can go. It can just be part of a discussion. And there's another problem, though, where it often comes to certain communication problems between, say, parties and movements. And that was, for example, visible at this attack conference, where we had this panel where members of the German parliament discussed with members of civil society. And there are differences in perception. There are differences in understanding maybe the complexity of different parts of society. And I personally don't have a perfect solution for that problem, but can be experienced that there is a certain alienation between established politics and civil society, sure enough. Okay.
Why is this project so focused on Europe, especially on Germany? Because it sounds like this is the master plan to ensure luxury in Europe, especially Germany. And it's a misunderstanding, I think so, in the real problems in the world. Because our luxury, from where it comes. I was voluntary in one of the so-called developing countries, and so I think this model is an absolute plan to ensure luxury here. And where is the global aspect in this? And
I wouldn't say that its intention is to preserve luxury here, but fair enough, the starting point for the specific first project was to ensure prosperity for a desirable large part, or society. That was the starting point of this project. And I showed that it has evolved over time. It started out in 2007 into preliminary result in 2009. Now we have two further projects within that. Now we are in 2012. And it expands. I don't know if in the end that we will have a master plan. Would be interesting, but it is certainly more elaborate on the German and the European situation than on the global situation. There, you are certainly right, but I don't know, or I'm not sure if that is the end of the project. It rather seems to expand and also combine other regions gradually.
So you started only in Europe, Germany, approaching, then you want to expand. But why are you starting with global problems and resolving from the basic symptomatics of the world crisis and beginning from only a part of use? Because I don't think German society is the whole global society. So
yeah, but the starting point of this project, we could say it was historically, it was the findings of another study that in our eyes were quite alarming. I showed you that cake diagram where almost 2/3 of society don't have any interest in politics whatsoever.
Lecker. Kartoffeln mit Pilzen passen sehr gut.
Ich habe ja auch noch eine Pfeffermühle, wenn jemand möchte.
Oh. Bisschen Pfeffer.
Oder hier so. Frischen Pfeffer. Stiller Korb. Wer brodelt da?
Oh shit. Das bin ich, glaube ich.